Ah, okay. Hi, everybody. This is MMT and the Public Purpose on MMT Tuesday. And I'm your host, Joe Firestone. And tonight we're going to talk about the basics of inflation. And we're also going to talk about the experience of my guest, Jeff Epstein, at the Levy Summer Session. Before we do that, though, I want to introduce Jeff. He and I have had a number of interviews in the past. For years now, he's been trying to teach the basics of MMT, but at an introductory level. And he also has a podcast where he has interviewed most of the major figures of MMT at one time, or another. And that podcast has been very successful and a very useful one. He recently got a scholarship to go to the MMT Summer Session, at the Levy Institute. And that's what he's going to tell us about here tonight. I should mention, that I don't think Lisa Theobald will be able to attend here. At this point, this is her last night of her vacation out in California. And so she has an obligation for a dinner engagement and won't be able to be here since it's at the same time as this show. So with that, as an introduction, I'm going to turn things over to Jeff. We are going to get into his experiences at the Levy Institute first for roughly a half hour. Then we're going to talk inflation for about, an hour. And I'm very excited to do both of these things. So I'm going to turn things over to Jeff now to tell us about his experiences.
Hi, Joe. Glad to see you again. I'm wearing my shirt that the Levy Institute gave us, the summer session gave us. It was a pretty amazing experience, actually. It was pretty amazing. So there was this was in Annandale-on-Hudson, which is a gorgeous spot on the Hudson River. I have some really nice pictures. So this was a summer session for a week for graduate students or wannabe graduate, that level, whatever. And then the week previous was another session. I don't know what it was called, but basically another session for undergraduates. So there were a lot of people that were already there. So for example, Patricia Pino and Dirk Entz had some role in the previous session, so they were already there. And then they joined, the next one. So all the lecturers stayed in one dorm. All the participants stayed in two other dorms. So there was two dorms of students is the wrong word, but whatever, students and teachers. Students in two dorms and teachers in one dorm, and it was basically like a week of college, and not just in the academic sense, but like at night there was serious socializing in the common rooms of the dorms. And that felt very college-y. They went on beer runs and they came back with cases and cases of beer. And I actually brought my guitar. I drove, so I got a bike rack, which I needed anyway for a different reason. But I got a bike rack a little early. I brought my bike, I brought my guitar, and I went bike riding the day I got there early. And at these night things, when we had all these socializing, I would just play my guitar and people would sing and whatever. And it was really, really, it was really cool. Hold on a second. So there was really interesting, I mean, there was 6 conferences a day, 6 panels a day, and some of them were lectures and some of them were panel discussions of some of the lecturers that were there that day went on a panel and would just talk or accept questions, and it was very interactive. And actually one of the more exciting moments for me was as far as the panels were concerned, was there was something called the Stock Flow Lab. And what it was doing economic equations, it's not the right term, but economic equations, implementing them in software. So it was basically Excel spreadsheet for economics. And it was really exciting. I didn't expect to enjoy that so much. So we had 2 days of an hour and a half or 2 hours each of just learning how to implement equations is the wrong word, but equations into models, into software. And we'd see them, how to do the variables, which is exogenous, which are endogenous, and how to set.
Software you used, Kay, was Excel?
No, it was as if it was Excel for economics. The software gave me the feeling of as if it were like putting each cell had a certain thing. It wasn't that. It was, I don't know what it.
Was the software actually system dynamics software that you were using?
It was a specifically economics modeling software, which I could find out the name, but I don't recall offhand. It wasn't a single thing of like, a grid of rectangles like Excel, but it had that feeling of, you make a change in one spot and then everything changed. And so you would start it after you have to declare your exogenous variables, and then for each one you have to create the formula, and those formulas include other variables and so on. And then you have to set the the values that never change. So something in your equation is always going to be a 6. So you set that to 6, and then you run it, and then it'll graph it for you based on what range you want. And it was very exciting. It was only a taste, but it was very exciting, and it's similar.
For just a second, could you explain to people what an exogenous variable is and what an endogenous variable is?
An endogenous variable, and you'll correct me, but I believe I understand. Endogenous variable is something that is set in the economy, in the public. An exogenous variable is something that is set by an external force that you have no control over. So,
just for example, the Federal Reserve.
So the government is exogenous to the economy. We are in the public. We are the private sector, which is endogenous, which is the endogenous as far as the economy is concerned. And exogenous, for example, is the government, who can just simply define, for example, the interest rate. So the interest rate is exogenously determined by the FOMC board of the central bank, which is part of the government. So
right.
In this
to describe that is that the interest rate is a policy variable.
I believe it's true. It's exogenously. It's an exogenous variable. It's an exogenous. If you use that as part of your model, your equation, then that would be an exogenous variable.
It would be, if that's the way you set up your model. Exactly.
Right. And so the money supply, the amount of money in the economy, is endogenously determined based on bank loans, which is determined by banks deciding that a person will pay it back and so on. So the money supply, how much money we have in the economy, is endogenously determined, which is like, you know, the endogenous theory of money or something like that. You know, it's a big concept of MMT. Is I'm not saying the title right, and I can't think of the correct title, but you know, endogenous money. So that was the software part of it, and it was kind of it was extra exciting because number one, I was really tired. I just happened to sleep not great the night before, and the two previous sessions were very interesting, but they were not very charismatic speakers. So my being tired and then, you know, hearing these two sessions which were not so as exciting, and then the software, the Stock Flow Lab started, and it just like woke me up. I was just like, whoa! That was great. You know, I met John, which was awesome, for the first time in person, John Harvey,
Yes.
which was really nice. But the best, what are we doing on time? My absolute favorite part of the entire session was spending time with Patricia Pino and Sam Levy and Dirk Entz and a lot of other people. It was a large campus where you had to walk. So the dorm was on one end, the cafeteria was kind of in the middle, and then Levy would, so dorm, and then a cafeteria, and then Levy, and you had to walk all day long. And actually, that was the most exciting part for me, was to be able to walk with Patricia and all these people and to just talk with them about nothing until we made it to the either lunch or the, you know, or the panels, the sessions. That was really special. That was a really special memory for me. So what else? The one guy that a lot of the panels gave you readings to prepare, and the one that I like really decided I was going to read about because it was something I'm interested in learning more about, which is QE. So Paul Sheard, if you've heard of him, really interesting guy. He wrote 3 papers, one on that banks create money when they lend, you know, the what's it called? The loanable funds theory is bunk. You know, banks create money when they lend, and he also wrote 2 papers which are related on QE, which is basically an FAQ on frequently asked questions on QE. And I really, you know, I want to better understand that. And he gave he's a very nice, interesting guy, who is the chief economist at, I forget what, S&P, something like that, some ratings agency. And he's had a 4-year something at Harvard University. So Larry Summers is his boss. So he just ended his 4 years after the session, just like a couple weeks ago. But he gave a really interesting. His papers are very interesting, and he gave a really interesting talk. And because I had read those papers, I had a very detailed question for him, which I could ask you. I'm not going to do it now, but like it's a question I can conceive of myself having a conversation with you about. So I wrote down a very detailed question because I had read his papers and found them very interesting, and I really wanted to know something. And as soon as he was done, I raised my hand, and it just didn't get to me. So I never got to ask my question, the one big question that I wanted to ask. So I spoke to him afterwards, and he was like, "Let's do an interview." So I'll hopefully eventually I'll do an interview, and I'll be able to answer his question, ask him the question, and
Oops! Wait. We might have had something unexpected. Specifically, I think Lisa is here, but she's not fully visible at this point. Hey, Lisa, are you here?
I am here, but
hey, visible Lisa.
Hi. Apparently my camera's not working, and I'm going to be very honest. Dinner is in wait, so I'm only going to be here for a little bit, but I wanted to stop in and say hello. Jeff, hi.
Cool.
So
hello.
good to see you.
You too. It's so good to not see you.
I know. I don't know why my camera's not working, but that's okay. Carry on. I'll just sit here for a little bit.
Cool. What was I saying? You happen to remember?
What you were talking
about.
You didn't get to ask your question
Yes.
of Mr. Sherd.
Paul Sheard. And then there was another interesting, just an interesting moment. Sandy Darity came virtually and spoke about the job guarantee and then took a lot of questions. And there was a very interesting disagreement that he has with the MMT proposal of the job guarantee. I believe it's almost entirely agreed upon, except that Sandy Darity would much prefer, adamantly prefers it to be federally administered. Not just paid for, but administered federally. And his reasoning is very interesting, actually, that he fears localities having virulent discrimination, which is understandable.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that.
Perfectly understandable.
Yeah.
It's been a concern of mine as well.
So my thoughts are like, that makes sense, but you just simply have to make a decision of, if it's federally administered, you're going to deal with federal racism, and it's going to be much more difficult to stand up against one massive behemoth. But on the other hand, I mean, I think it's just a very difficult choice. You're either going to have 1,000 points, a million, tons of points where each individual one you're going to have to fight, potential racism in that locality, or you're going to have the federal, which hopefully will do well. His argument was, I would much rather avoid the localities being, discriminatory, because that's obviously historic, that's a reality of history. Yeah. And he would rather have one place where you have to fight. So, that's a very interesting difference. And I think to a significant extent, it's really just a decision. They both have their advantages and disadvantages, and you can argue for both sides, and maybe there's some way to balance or compromise or whatever it is. So that was kind of, that was one of the bigger disagreements of the week, although obviously he's I would say almost entirely on board with MMT. That's one disagreement that he has, which I found very interesting.
Yes, I would like to see him debate that with some of the MMTers.
I think too that isn't this going to depend on what this actually looks like? I mean, it would be easier to be able to make these decisions if we saw a proposal.
That's true. I don't know how concrete the MMT proposal is, but it's certainly close to well-defined anyway. But yeah, no, I think a debate would be a particular debate on that one topic. With some prominent people. I mean, I think Rowan would be really interesting.
Specifically Pavlina
and Pavlina and Sandy, I think would be a really interesting discussion just to hash out that one detail.
Yes, it would be a wonderful debate. But there might be some policy compromises, that you can make, such that if you could measure degree of racism in localities in the United States, then you might be able to make a decision that certain places are going to be federally administered and other places, are going to be locally administered. I know that would be very controversial, and the Supreme Court might have something to say about that, but you could always do jurisdiction stripping, so the Supreme Court is not a part of the game.
And you could also
standard.
And you could also have just conditions. You will not be federally administered as long as.
Yeah, you will not be federally.
Yeah, there you go.
As long as, but yes. Okay, so you could do something like that as a compromise, between the two positions.
Yeah, I think that would be a really interesting debate. I'm curious of who would be most appropriate. Obviously, Pavlina, because she's job guarantee, but Sandy has the racial history background, which I think it's. I'm sure Pavlina doesn't have nearly as strong a racial history background as he does. So I wonder who would be the best person. But so anyway, that was a really interesting moment of the week as well. So I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff. I could think of a few more things.
Okay, please do think of a few more things.
Okay. There was a couple people that I met that started off the week with a little bit of I'll say skepticism. That's probably not really the right word, but and by the end of the week, I can think of two people that kind of said this kind of thing to me, which was, I knew the basics of MMT, but I didn't realize how interdisciplinary and how much of a movement it is, of how much the MMT kind of core concepts, that's just the nucleus of a lot of stuff orbits around that, of law and interdisciplinary, and Raul had an interesting panel on cryptocurrency, which is not directly related to MMT, and Rowan was talking about law and just the atmosphere and how excited some people are. I think struck some people that learning the concepts is only part of the process. So,
okay, could you mention the full names of Raul, and Rowan for our folks?
Raul Carrillo gave a very interesting talk on cryptocurrency. I think it was more broad than that, but cryptocurrency. And Rowan Gray spoke on at least a couple. He spoke at least twice, maybe even 4 times on panels, lectures and panels. Obviously regarding the law. He's a law professor at Willamette University, I believe, in New York.
He's also, though, one of the deepest of the MMT thinkers, I think.
Okay.
But true, isn't he? Wouldn't you agree?
I think he knows an incredible amount. I don't know to compare him to everybody else, but certainly he's an important figure. Sure.
Very important figure right now. Okay, were there any particular other presentations that you liked, that you thought were really fine, and could you say what was outstanding about them?
Well, one of the first panels, I think it was the first panel after the half-hour introduction, from Papa Meditrus, I think. Randy Ray gave basically an introduction to MMT. It was an hour and a half long or something like that. And all I remember is I kind of understood most of it, but all I remember is writing down on a piece of paper. Patricia was sitting next to me, and I wrote down on a piece of paper saying, "Fire hose."
Fire hose. Oh, he was giving you a fire hose in an hour and a half?
So, and she said to me, what does that mean? And I said, drinking from a fire hose. And she didn't quite understand that, I guess, whatever. And it was so fast and so much information that I kind of understood a lot of it, but if I spent a second writing down something, I would have missed four next things, So it was very interesting, kind of just how high speed and aggressive he could just get all that out. It was very interesting.
So did Stephanie give a presentation there?
Oh, she was the first, actually. Yeah, she was the first. So she gave a memory of basically she spoke about 2008 crisis, COVID, and I think 3 major crises, and how they were dealt with publicly versus how MMT wants to deal with them. So, yeah. And then she was on I believe 2 panels where she kind of moderated one and then just participated in another. So.
Okay, another question. Okay, was Andres Bernal there?
No, he was not.
God, I sort of regret that. He was doing some really interesting work on inflation.
That's true.
It would have been nice for him to be there.
Would have been nice to meet him in person.
Who were the people talking about inflation?
Talking about inflation? Quite a lot. I think the whole second to last day was almost dedicated to it. I don't have the schedule in front of me, but there was a good whole day dedicated to it. Yeah, Yeva Nersessian talked about. She had graphs of showing that it was, the composition of the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, which is a major measurement of inflation, and showed the composition of that, and where it's called transportation, but I think it means used cars. That the price of used cars, because chips can't be found to produce new cars, and so there's pressure on used cars. So, but it's called transportation. So but I believe that that's what it was meant to be used cars. And so she was saying, this is what it's made up of. So if you are in the market for a new car or a car, then inflation affects you. If you're not, then this huge part of what's currently inflation disappears. And so inflation is not going to affect you as much. It doesn't mean that you don't have real world problems and that you're not suffering. There's tons of stuff going around, and we're going to get more into this in a few minutes regarding inflation. That doesn't mean that there's not things that are bad for you, but prices are not the only thing in the world. So if you're not in the market for used cars, and inflation is largely driven by used cars, then inflation really doesn't matter to you. But they use that to scare everybody. So Yeva talked about it a lot. There was panels on it. It's kind of a vague memory. I can't really recall. I have notes and whatever, but.
So just to clarify one final thing, because we're almost at a half hour and should shift to the basics, of inflation.
Yes.
But one final thing. You said that there were 6 sessions per day.
We started at 9:30, and then 1, 2. I think it was around 6 sessions a day. Yeah.
For how many days?
8 days.
For 8 days.
Saturday through Saturday.
So you had 48 sessions.
Yeah. I would say there was a good half lectures, a third panels, and the rest of it was a couple of breakout sessions where I went with Fidel and maybe 10 other people, and we just sat outside and just talked. And so there was 4 leaders. Fidel was one of those leaders, and a quarter of the participants would go with each of those people and just talk about the topic that had been going on. Yeah.
Okay, so to summarize, the summer school is a very intense sort of immersion in MMT.
Yeah, it was awesome. It was awesome.
So
yeah, I wrote tons of notes, and it was great. And I met amazing. I mean, aside from being able to see people that I've known in person, Dirk and Sam and Patricia, to be able to spend time with them in person for rare time, that was the best part for me. But I met tons of really, really cool people, in addition to the people that I had already known from a distance, Stephanie and so on.
I'm so happy for you, Jeff, and I'm really excited, and I will watch this again, but I have to go. I just wanted to let you know I'm going to sign off, and I might dump in later, but
it was nice being next to you in a live stream.
Yeah, I'll fix my camera. And we'll
See you later.
Again.
Enjoy the rest of your safe trip home.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for coming, Lisa. Bye. Okay. So here we are. I guess that's a good breaking point for moving into the basics of inflation.
Cool. Just go?
Just go.
All right. Partially because of the summer session, but even more from the recent interviews that I've done. The first thing I'm going to talk about is something I got out of interview with John Harvey, which actually just was released on Sunday, when I got this insight. And he barely even talked about it. But for some reason, it just triggered an insight for me that was kind of unrelated to our conversation. So I've come up with what I think are 3 major theories of inflation, understandings of inflation that are very different, but are completely compatible. And I'm I'm circling around, I think, kind of the heart of everything, and I'm looking forward to putting these things together. But I'm confident that I'm close to correct with all three of these things. And now it's a matter of kind of seeing how these things connect and relate together. So, so first is just a brief aside, which is I now understand generally what stagflation is. And stagflation is doing nothing to solve the inflation we have and also putting people out of work and causing them extra suffering.
Yes, in other words, having austerity.
Doing nothing to solve the problem and causing a new problem.
Causing a new problem by having austerity because you think the austerity is going to solve the inflation problem.
You think it will, right?
You think
that's what you say. That's what you say, whether you believe it or whatever. So yeah, stagflation is just
the Federal Reserve has said.
That's what they say. Correct. They think that that's going to solve the problem, or they say they think that's going to solve the problem.
But they also admit they don't have a theory of inflation.
Well,
okay, so while
details.
They don't have a coherent theory of inflation. They don't follow the do not harm idea.
Right, and which happens to serve their interests. So,
yes.
So I kind of understand inflation generally, just vaguely, which is just doing nothing to solve the problem at hand and creating a whole new problem on top of it. That's what stagflation is, adding insult to injury. Okay, so the first, So the first insight that I got, which is something that John Harvey said to me in the interview that was released just a couple days ago. He only said it in passing, but something really struck me regarding that. And that's this, that inflation is not a disease or a symptom. It's a measurement. It's a measurement of something. It's a measurement of prices going up somewhere, somehow, for some reason. You have no idea where, you have no idea why, you have no idea how. All you know is that prices have gone up. So when someone says inflation, we have inflation, that's what they mean, because they're not referring to a particular sector for a particular reason. They're just saying the overall inflation number. So whatever it is, 8.5% or 7.5%.
Overall inflation number, okay, it's an aggregate inflation number. And mostly they're talking about the CPI.
CPI. So they're talking about the total CPI number, which 7.5%. Okay? So 7.5% inflation. Oh, that's horrible. We must make inflation go down. They're not talking about whether or not that person has any interest in used cars. So used cars is driving the inflation in the current inflation is being driven largely by used car sales, used car prices.
You're right.
But
or computer chips.
Because of the lack of computer chips. So when people say inflation, they are only thinking of that top line number and not referring to any particular problem in the economy and why that problem is happening.
Such as housing, the affordability of housing, or transportation in general.
Correct.
Okay, or supply problems, in oil.
So inflation, the number inflation that's always used is referring to prices going up for something somewhere in the economy for some reason. We have no idea what. Based on that number, you have no idea what.
Yeah.
But that number is the only thing that we talk about. That number is the only thing we talk about, and that number is used to scare people.
Yes.
That number is used to scare people, and people really are scared by it as if it's a horror movie. And it is so scary and so enthralling that it distracts. It is used as a distraction from the real world. So it is used to distract from looking at what is actually causing that measurement to go up and what is causing that to happen. So the analogy that I've come up with is, or whatever, partially I came up with this. A thermometer to sickness is the same as inflation to the real world. So thermometer measures your temperature. And if your temperature is high, then your body, yeah, I mean, maybe you're just in a sauna and you're fine. But usually you don't measure yourself when you measure your temperature in a sauna. You usually measure it when you're at home. So if that's the case, then your body has a higher temperature than normal, which means that your body is fighting something. Something is off. What? You have no idea. Knowing what the temperature is gives you no indication of what's wrong with you, aside from the fact that something is worth looking into. That's all that inflation, the top number does, and that's all that the temperature does, is tell you that something is worth looking into. I have no idea what it is, but something is worth looking into. So if your goal is to lower inflation, if your goal is to lower the temperature on that thermometer, then just stick it in a cup of ice. Temperature's gone down. Hallelujah. We don't have to worry about our temperature anymore. And I know this isn't totally analogous, but Federal Reserve raises their interest rates, puts people out of work. So if people have no money to spend, prices are going to go down. And so this kitchen feeds everyone who comes in a really good meal. Everyone who steps foot in this kitchen gets a really good meal. Let's just ignore the millions who are locked out of this kitchen. So that's how we solve inflation, not by increasing production of food, which we have plenty of, but by locking people out of the kitchen. And we say that we've solved hunger. We've solved hunger because everyone who enters this kitchen gets a great meal. We've solved hunger. And we're ignoring all the millions of people locked out of the kitchen.
Who go hungry because they're locked out of the kitchen.
Correct, but we don't consider them in the statistics. So hunger has been solved, officially speaking. So do you care about lowering inflation? Do you care about lowering the temperature on the thermometer? Or do you care about curing that person and eliminating their sickness? So so basically, do you care about the person and curing that person and what's bothering them in the real world? Or do you care about curing the temperature? And if you care about curing the temperature, just stick it in water, ignore that person, let them, by sticking it in water, you are pushing those real costs onto the sick person. So if a parent takes a temperature of their kid, they have a temperature, they stick it in a nice cup of ice, temperature's gone, so now I can send my kid to school. I have pushed those real costs onto my kid and to everyone in their classroom.
Yes.
That's how you push real costs onto other people in these ways, and that's the class conflict theory of inflation, which is a few part of this what we'll talk about later. So that's my first analogy, which is the idea of a thermometer being sickness. So if you want to say your thoughts regarding that, I think that's pretty clearly correct. It's kind of a broad, vague view of it, but I think it's a correct view of it. So
yeah, I think it's a valid view of it also.
Cool. Okay. So all right, so I'll go on to the next one. John Harvey says inflation is a signal. So again, the top line number of inflation or the temperature on a thermometer is a signal that you need to look into something in the real world. So if inflation goes up, the top line number of inflation goes up, that is a signal that you need to look at something in the real world to try and solve that problem in the real world. If the temperature goes up, you need to look at that patient and determine what in the real world is going wrong with that person in the real world and solve that problem. And another analogy is grades. The child's grades go down is a signal that something is wrong with that child. Obviously, that's the report card is very narrow excuse me, is a very narrow evaluation of a child, of just some very, subjects through the bias of a teacher and so on. But if a report card, if the child's grades go down, that is a signal to that's something you need to go and analyze that child to see if there's something going on in the real world that needs to be solved. And by doing that, by going to that child and talking to him, by going to that sick person and analyzing what is causing their sickness and treating it and treating that child and dealing with that problem, and going into the real world of inflation and determining, it's used car prices because we can't find chips to do new cars, and so that's pushing the price of used cars up. By doing those things in the real world, you cause those numbers, those measurements of inflation to go down, of their grades to go higher, inflation to get better, their grades to get better, and their temperature to get better by doing those things in the real world. But we are so fixated on that number that we allow the problems in the real world to go untaken care of, the not taking care of those problems.
Right, or we even make those problems worse.
And yes, and those on top leverage that to throw fake solutions at us, which happen to benefit them. And we're so busy staring at that number and happy that their solution makes that number go down that we ignore the real problems. Sam Levy said a great line in response to a New York Times article a great article about Larry Summers. And he said, Sam said, like, who cares if I can't afford food because a five pack of tube socks at Walmart is so cheap. Or no, TVs are so cheap. I don't care that food is expensive as long as TVs are cheap. And it's like we're focusing on the wrong things. So it's just like we're so fixated on these top line measurements that we ignore the real world, when the reality is, if we ignored these top line measurements and only went into the real world and fixed the problems with that child or with that sick person or with those prices, then those measurements would obviously improve. So we should ignore these numbers. We should only go in the real world, but we spend all of our time only focusing on these numbers.
And we should spend our time instead focusing on the real world and just seeing these numbers as basically signals. Okay. In other words, numbers should tell us we got to be studying the real world very, very carefully. Okay.
Correct.
Mention something that's also significant. That real world number is a macroeconomic number, but the way to improve that that sort of number, is that we have to get into the microeconomy, and maybe even more than the microeconomy, we have to get into policy, we have to get into culture, we have to get into sociological problems. There's a whole range of things we have to get into to actually fix or change what's going on with that signal.
Yes. I recently interviewed Dirk Entz, who is being released in 2 weeks, and he said that macroeconomics is the study of the systemic effects of microeconomics, and that you can't separate microeconomics and macroeconomics. It cannot be separated. And so, like you said, that macroeconomics is obviously influenced by microeconomics.
Okay, and so would you characterize that as being a general position that is commonly accepted inside of the MMT world right now? So instead of MMT being just a macroeconomics approach, it's no longer that. It's much broader.
MMT, as I understand it, and actually the person who kind of helped me understand this was Sherry Wise, which is that MMT is the study of how money moves through the economy, which is a part of macroeconomics. So what's your reaction?
Well, my reaction is that it doesn't give enough of a clue to the very broad concerns, okay, of MMT, because it's too narrowly focused on the movement of money through the economy.
Okay, well,
And to me, MMT is concerned with far more than that, especially as the years have gone by. The focus on money and the facts of money and the consequences of how we treat money has now, and pretty much because of the inflation problem, uh, has now started to get us into many other disciplines. And so, in any definition of MMT that I would like to try, uh, I'd like that to have a part in it.
so I think the descriptive aspect of MMT is how money moves through the economy. I think that's closer to being accurate. Yes? You would agree more with that? The descriptive, just purely the descriptive aspect of MMT, of the mechanics of the institutional aspect of how the Fed and the Treasury work together and Congress works and
But now, in terms of the approach to inflation, the descriptive aspect of MMT is much broader than just the flow of money.
okay, fair enough. I'm just expressing whatever. So I don't know the answer to your question, which was, is that the view of MMT people, whatever, but I actually don't remember the specific question, but basically I mean, maybe you should refresh what that question was and then answer it yourself, because I don't think I'm the person to answer that.
Okay, the question was whether Dirk Ence's view was a commonly accepted view now, inside of MMT, that
Microeconomics and macroeconomics.
MMT approach has gone beyond the study, of macroeconomics, and is now very involved not only with microeconomics, but with lots of other micro factors like sociological factors, sustainability factors, various other things that traditionally have not been considered a part of either microeconomics or macroeconomics. It refers more to what you said earlier, saying that going to the summer school made you keenly aware for the first time of the interdisciplinary aspects, of MMT.
It made other people aware. It made me more aware, but I was referring, just to be clear, I was referring to other people, but yes, it made me more aware of that for sure.
Yeah, I had the realization a long time ago, actually, that even though the MMTers didn't really talk about it much, that increasingly, especially someone like a Randy Ray or Pavlina, that they were thinking about it more from a general systems point of view. In other words, as a study that didn't really have any narrow boundaries in the disciplinary structure of most of the universities, and colleges. And so I've seen them expanding their point of view now for a very long time. Scott Fulweiler's work has always been very broadly concerned with many disciplines, and not just with macroeconomics.
I think that's fair.
Okay, please continue.
Just a moment.
Oh, by the way, I just had a couple of interviews with Matt Forstatter.
Okay.
And I have this impression from Matt also.
Okay.
That he's thoroughly approaching things in terms of unifying various disciplines inside of the MMT approach. Okay, we talked a lot about that in the two streams we've so far had. And in fact, he's coming back on the 19th.
Oh, nice.
Some of the issues we raised still.
I met him for the first time in person as well at the session, which was really nice.
Yeah, he's really an interesting guy.
Yeah, he's a very, very positive person. So Goodhart's Law. Are you familiar with Goodhart's Law? I'll explain it.
Goodhart's Law, Charles Goodhart.
Yes.
So familiar with Charles Goodhart I'm not familiar with Goodhart's law, though. So
When a measurement becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measurement.
oh,
And so
okay.
a lot of what we've been talking about is lowering the temperature at all costs, lowering inflation at all costs, raising the child's grades at all costs, becomes a target. No different than lowering the deficit, lowering the debt. And I mean, there's more meaning to lowering inflation. I mean, for some cases, it does make sense to lower inflation. It does make sense to raise a child's grade. It does make sense to lower temperature. But still, treating it the way that we treat it essentially makes it into a target in a terrible sense, meaning ignoring the real world parts of it.
That law is something that is recognized in many other areas of the social sciences. In other words, when an indicator, however much a key indicator it is, when that indicator replaces the concept as something that you're going to focus on, what usually happens is that you lose the concept.
Yes. Another example is GDP. So GDP is a meaningful measurement for some reasons, but using it as the measurement of a society's well-being is terrible.
Yes, absolutely. And Stephen Hale, okay, and his buddies, okay, in Australia, okay, of course, okay, are all about trying to look a lot more broadly, okay, than GDP.
Correct. Phil Lawn is creating, I believe it's called the Genuine Progress Indicator,
Yeah,
which
GPI.
right. So you don't need to get rid of GDP. You just need to stop using it as the primary measurement of a society's well-being. And so he has created the Genuine Progress Indicator, which I'm hoping to start a master's at Torrens starting in September. Their official announcement is Friday for the program, Friday evening. And obviously, the degree is called Economics of Sustainability. So it's ecological economics plus MMT. And obviously, and Phil Lawn and Stephen Hale are basically the two primary economists doing it. And so the Genuine Progress Indicator is going to be an important part of that. And eventually, in a few years, when there starts to be PhD students, continuing to develop the Genuine Progress Indicator is going to be, a good option for the first PhD candidates in this program. So GDP basically counts everything. Well, not everything. It doesn't count a lot of good stuff like parents raising kids and and reading to a kid after school and whatever, or lots of good stuff that can't be measured with money. But it measures, Phil uses the example of like if you crash your car, you get a new car, you go to the hospital, you get a wheelchair, you get tons of medical stuff. You're a mess. Your car's a mess. But that added to GDP. Yay. And fossil fuel, a new coal plant is online. Yay, we've increased GDP. But in the Genuine Progress Indicator, these things would have less of an effect or a negative effect on the total measurement of genuine progress, because creating a new coal plant is horrible for society. An accident that debilitates somebody or destroys their car or whatever is bad for society. And maybe we should include things like raising kids too, and more, more difficult to quantify with money kinds of things into the well-being of society.
So specifically with respect to GDP, it doesn't include sustainability measures or sustainability indicators. That's one example, okay, of what's not included, okay, in GDP.
And what is included is things that destroy our sustainability.
Right. But, okay, with respect to GPI, some sustainability indicators are included. And that's one of the main differences between GDP, okay, and the GPI indicators. There's another approach also. Here's a book that's by Thomas, and McElroy. The reason why I know this book is because, but for years, I worked but with Mark very, very closely on papers and books, in the knowledge management area. The title of this book is The Multi-Capital Scorecard. It's done at the organizational performance level, but the kinds of indicators talked about, in this book are similar in some ways to the genuine progress indicator. But there's a little bit of a different approach taken here than the approach the economists take. The attempts here are to define basically normative standards, for organizations that organizations should be accomplishing if they're going to contribute to sustainability. Mark is working on similar indicators, at the national level as well. In other words, there's a normative approach to indicators in here as well as a descriptive approach to indicators. So that's something that isn't included in the GPI approach as I understand it. It's more purely descriptive, as opposed to normative. So I just wanted to call your attention to that and tell you that this is a really interesting book.
Okay.
And I will give you the reference in the DM.
Okay, thank you. I've not heard of that before.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm just learning about GDP. I'm just learning about GDP, but the basics are, what the little that we've just said, I think pretty much says it all. It includes bad stuff. Bad stuff increases the point. Bad stuff increases our scores, and a lot of good stuff does not increase our scores. And we need to. As I understand the genuine progress indicator, it's not that it just includes good stuff and excludes bad stuff. It rates. I believe it rates individual things as good or bad, and then I guess it weighs it based on its goodness, its benefits, how beneficial it is.
There's also something else I think is relevant here with respect to the Ukraine war. We approached that war, by looking at the Russian economy and thinking as, that economy is 1/15, of our own. So, we shouldn't be considering Russia as very strong because it just, it has this economy which, based on the GDP indicator, is 1/15, the size of our own. So how could they possibly stand against our sanctions? So this is another thing that addresses the question of the GDP indicator. It's terribly misleading to assess the economic strength of a country based on the GDP of that country. Because for particular purposes, having certain economic strengths is very, very important when you're considering fighting a war, against another country, and also figuring that you're going to do an economic war against that same country. It may turn out that that country, because of the makeup of its economic activity, is more capable of taking your economic sanctions and throwing them right back at you, which is what's going on in the real world today. We now have a situation where the whole economy of Europe is about to be entirely upended by Russian counter-sanctions, if they choose to do it. And we had no idea that this might happen, as far as I can see. There was no planning at all to counter that.
So
that fits into the idea that GDP is not an indicator we ought to depend upon for too much.
So I think I believe you're saying that we've been misled by GDP because according to GDP, they're only a 15th of our size, but they have still done some very potent things despite being that small. That's so-called that small.
Yes, because they're not small when it comes to material wealth. They're not small when it comes to real resources. They're not small when it comes to the basics of an economy, like food, okay, and energy. In those areas, they are very, very big.
They wouldn't be able to even consider waging a war unless they had those things.
Right.
Because they would be shut off by the rest of the world by sanctions and by other countries no longer importing, whatever, to try and punish them. They can't hurt their currency if they have what they need internally in order to feed them, take care of themselves and to fight the war. They'll sacrifice those on the bottom. They'll always sacrifice those on the bottom. But in general, they can take care of themselves and wage the war with what they have. Therefore, these sanctions and these, I'm not allowing them to, not exporting to Russia, what we would have exported to them before, or not purchasing from them the oil and whatever we were purchasing from them before, doesn't hurt them because they're fine on their own.
Right, but it wasn't even as simple as that. They worked for years to plan to find alternative markets for their products, to easily find alternative markets. They had a plan for that because they knew these sanctions were coming. They also had a plan for importing things they needed to have for their technological base from China, who had the capacity to supply them with these things. So that before they decided to go after Ukraine and defend their national security, they took care of their rear end in terms of their planning, okay, and also their alliances. Okay, and there's evidence that what happened, okay, in terms of the Donbass was that, of course, we had a coup, in the Ukraine that we caused in 2014. This unleashed a civil war there, okay, in the Ukraine, which wasn't much covered by the press here, but there were 14,000 deaths between 2014, okay, and now as a result of the civil war, okay. The Russians strongly objected to the coup of 2014, but they did nothing then to try to counter that coup. Why did they do nothing then? Because they weren't ready.
Huh.
There's evidence that for the last 8 years, they got ready because they knew what was going to happen.
They knew what was going to happen. What did they know was going to happen?
They knew that we were going to hit them with a proxy war, okay, in Ukraine, and we were going to hit them with economic sanctions because they'd seen us hit all kinds of other nations with economic sanctions all over the world.
Proxy war meaning we would have puppeted Ukraine to attack them.
That we would have puppeted Ukraine to defend themselves basically to the last person because we would provide them with the material wherewithal to do so. And we did that for the purpose of weakening the Russians, of draining Russia. We viewed it as sort of getting Russia into another Vietnam so that they would never come back as a great power. In other words, that was our motive.
And that's what's happening right now, I believe, right?
That's what's
we
happening
keep on
now. Except the Russians are doing too well. And the possibility is that this war is going to be over at the end of August. And if that's what happens, then we wouldn't have had the time we needed to extend this war. And not only that, one of the consequences or implications of the war is that we have now pushed everybody, okay, into creating a not, okay, a unipolar world economically speaking, but a multipolar world economically. In other words, in response to the war, they are creating a new financial system which is not dependent on the United States, weakening the power of our economic sanctions, but all over the world, and creating a situation where there won't be, from the economic standpoint, this kind, okay, of unipolar world anymore. That after this conflict is over, that's going to be largely gone, and we're going to have to adjust to a new situation.
Very interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
And the fact that they have oil is a huge part of their leverage, and the fact that everybody else is not trying to get off of oil is a huge part of Russia's leverage, and they're requiring people to purchase their oil with the ruble was a very interesting tactic to, you know.
It was a very interesting tactic, probably stimulated by the MMT approach, because Russia has some people over there who've been reading MMT. And so,
I mean, it's the right thing to do if you're, you know, if it was the right thing for him to do from his point of view. It was the right thing for him to, yes, and to keep their bank, which, I mean, because if you purchase with their money, that means by definition, I believe, that their central bank is in control. So they keep the transactions on their side of the border, and so they get to control the situation. Where if there's exchanges, then the transactions happen all over the world, and they're not as in control of the situation.
But it's not only the fact that they're strong in oil and gas, but over the last 10 years, they became very strong as an exporter, okay, of grain.
Hmm.
That's something they created. That was not the case in 2000.
Hmm.
In 2000, they had some troubles. But over this period, okay, of Putin basically either running the country with allies, okay, or by himself, he saw to it that they became extremely food secure and also a very important exporter, okay, of food. Okay, and Ukraine, of course, is another very important exporter, okay, of food. But if the Russians increase their influence over Ukraine, then of course they become very, very powerful, okay, in the food area. They already are, but even more so if they get the kind of influence that they're seeking, you know, in relation to Ukraine. So there's a real foreign policy success shaping up for them, which in turn is going to lower the prestige of the United States. And it may result even in the freeing of Europe. In other words, basically, Europe has been under domination from the United States for some time in foreign policy. It hasn't had an independent foreign policy, okay, of their own. Depending on what happens over the next 2, 3, 6 months, it may be that Europe is going to be free of the United States in the foreign policy area.
Interesting, because they don't have a consolidated military, so it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
Well, the point is, if it turns out there's no real military threat, but from Russia, that Russia just wants to play nice in general and is looking to its own security, then the Europeans won't feel a need for a very strong defensive posture, okay, of their own. I mean, right now they feel the need because of NATO, and we push them, okay, in respect to NATO.
Mm-hmm.
If they find after a while they don't need NATO, okay, because Russia, okay, is not an aggressive power, then it changes the international situation completely.
Wow, very interesting. Okay.
Anyway.
Well, I just a last comment on that is that I have not really followed that much at all. I mean, I just kind of don't want to, because it's so difficult to find, news sources that you can trust and whatever. And the little that I have seen is that Russia is not dominating, and that Ukraine is hitting their weapons side, depots and whatever, and that Ukraine is holding their own. But you're saying that Russia is doing pretty well.
Well, at this point, it's likely that Ukraine is losing 1,000 soldiers a day.
I don't know how much magnitude that is.
Okay, they originally they started this off with an army of roughly 200,000 regulars who were well trained and competent. They had another 400,000 militia or so. Okay, the militia has largely been depleted, at this point, and they're evidently losing something like 1,000 trained soldiers per day.
Interesting. Okay.
So, also the Russians attacked with only 200,000 soldiers. The estimates, of Russian losses are very hard to pin down. The Ukrainians are saying there were 30,000 fatalities. The Russian fatalities were 30,000.
Okay.
The Russians are saying their fatalities are only 4,000.
Okay.
Okay. I tend to think the Russian estimate is much closer to the truth, because I've been watching the progress of the war from day to day, how the Russians have been fighting the war, the strategies, tactics, involved in the battles, the goals of the Russians, and they appear to be accomplishing all of their major goals right now.
Okay. Interesting. All right. Thank you for sharing that. We have about 15 minutes left. Excuse me. I have one more concept.
Okay.
So going back to inflation, I have one more concept, which we've touched on a little bit, and that is that the conflict theory of inflation. And so this is a theory that started.
Class conflict theory of inflation, right?
Is that what the full name is? Class conflict theory of inflation. Okay. The class conflict theory of inflation, which started with Marx, and that MMT has adopted. Bill Mitchell is a Marxist. I believe that's correct to say that. And
yeah, probably.
And so he's discussed that in depth. He's discussed that in depth on his blog. Inflation is at its heart a consequence of class struggle. So workers on one side, workers fight for higher wages. On the other side, capitalists fight for higher profits. And it's always a battle over who's going to get that extra money, or who's going to have to suffer that less money, who's going to have to deal with having less money if the economy goes down. So it's always a battle over these two things. But critically, we have to allow that battle to happen. So government has to be complicit in order for that inflation to persist. In order for that conflict to persist, government has to be complicit. And obviously right now, government is a guard dog for capitalists.
Yes, because it's a neoliberal government.
Right. So they decimate unions. They persecute, whistleblowers and journalists who show that these costs are being borne and pushed onto workers. And so the nature of this pushing of real and financial costs onto each other. So, for example, a wage price spiral. So, union demands higher wages. The company says, sure, but here's higher prices. So basically, you have the same real wages as you had before. Even though you have more money, prices are higher. So you basically are in the same position as you were. The real wages
So
are the
there's
same.
a spiral.
And so they keep on going.
Yeah, so they
And
keep on going. So then the Federal Reserve comes in, okay, and they put in the higher interest rates. And then the higher interest rates cause a recession. And when they cause a recession, the workers, okay, are unemployed. So they can't sustain the conflict. It becomes
Correct.
a labor market that's a loose labor market instead of a tight labor market. And so therefore, the employers have the upper hand again.
So the government is a guard dog for capitalists, and
Yeah.
they cause a recession, which by definition, almost by definition, means making people unemployed, which lowers the power of workers to bargain for higher wages because they don't want to become one of those unemployed people. And so that's how government steps in and stops the fight.
Yes.
And they stop the fight, and they allow all of those costs to be pushed onto workers. All of those real and financial costs are pushed onto workers. And Polanyi, I recently read Polanyi's Great Transformation.
Yes, that's Carl Polanyi.
Carl Polanyi, 1944 book, 2001 edition. I read it several months ago, and holy cow, is that an important book. And he has a really interesting insight, which is, capitalism and neoliberalism is all about the unregulated market, free market.
Yes.
Don't interfere with the free market. Just let it be, because it always heals itself. Give it a little bit of time and it heals itself. If you interfere, it won't heal itself. And if you interfere, it'll make it worse, of course. So what Polanyi says is that, so that implies less government. Not interfering with the market implies less government. Stop interfering. Don't regulate markets. We want unregulated markets. But what Polanyi says is that unregulated markets actually requires more government, because the unregulated market causes such suffering that people complain about that suffering. And so the government has to step in to quash those protests. And that requires even more government than having a government that regulates the market. So a regulated market requires a smaller government, I think much smaller government, than an unregulated market, because that unregulated market requires a government that must suppress the suffering, the protests of those who are suffering the consequences of the unregulated market. It's a really, really interesting concept. So that people talk about, we need less government. Libertarian is about all less government. Government is by definition horrible, so we need less of it. But the very concept of unregulated market requires even more of it.
Yes.
It's a really interesting concept. So what does it mean to push real and financial costs onto others? And the way that it comes home for me, and actually that phrase I'm pretty sure comes from Sam Levy in a good post that he had a few years ago. Actually, very briefly, you helped me write an article about, you helped me, you gave me feedback on an article where I refer to this post by Sam Levy, whatever, just had that memory. So pushing real and financial costs onto others. I gave the example of the parent takes the temperature of their child. They put the thermometer into a cup of ice, and they say he doesn't have a temperature. According to the thermometer, there's no temperature. Sends their kid to school, which pushes the consequences of
other people
onto the child and to everybody that child is, all the classes and the teachers of that child, because they're contagious and now they're threatening the health of them. So they have pushed those costs onto others. Yes,
a particularly pregnant example during the time of COVID.
Yeah, totally. So it's the idea of the thermometer, of the analogy of the thermometer being the indicator of something, but we don't know what. You have to go into the real world. And do you care about lowering temperature and lowering inflation, or do you care about the problem in the real world and solving that problem? That's one aspect. The class conflict of inflation is another aspect, and they're very different, but they're also completely compatible with each other.
Yes.
And I feel like there's like three major kind of ways of looking at inflation that are quite different and yet at the same time completely compatible. And so, I haven't really put all of these things together, but I kind of have, I think, a much better understanding in kind of different points of view of this concept. So.
Okay, that is very, very interesting. Let me do something here. Okay, I'd like to pull up. I guess we're close to being over, but let me pull this up for you.
Before you say that, let me just say one last thing, and that is the Fed raising interest rates is another example of pushing financial costs onto workers by putting them out of work, and so they have to suffer the consequences of prices going up and their wages going down. And corporations don't have to suffer that. They don't have to pay those higher wages. They don't have to pay those wages at all for the people they let go, and they get to raise their prices without consequence. That's another example. And there's a great article by David Fields that describes how the interest rates going up works its way towards unemploying people, and that the interest rates going up is a major tool of capitalists in this conflict.
The examples of this, very good examples, date from actually the Carter administration. What happened at the end of the Carter administration?
Volcker.
In the beginning, Paul Volcker, and what he was doing, with the interest rates. Jay Powell seemed very interested in avoiding that for a very long time. In other words, there were calls for that for some months, actually, before he started raising interest rates. And he was resisting that because he knew what would happen. But then he eventually...
What is your view of what he thought would happen? You said because he knew what would happen. What would happen? Because the Volcker shock and the horror?
He knew that if it pushed it, it was going to be the workers who would be paying the bill.
Yeah.
He knew that. And I don't think he wanted to go that way, actually. But the pressure from Wall Street that he got, and from people like Larry Summers, eventually got too heavy for him. And he wasn't sufficiently grounded in the more real causes of inflation to try to formulate some other policies, which in his case would probably have involved a great deal more, of regulation, because the Fed is able to regulate business, has a lot of powers of regulation, but he never called on those. And he might have called on them. I think he didn't call on those because he didn't really know about them very much. His own personal toolbox, the only tool he could think of was to raise the interest rates.
Right. I mean, it's not like he's in charge. Why would he know these things?
Well, I guess he didn't feel, entirely in charge. I'd like to share the screen here for a minute to call your attention to one thing. Okay. This was in Andres's paper, which he wrote some months ago at the end of the year. He published this paper. Let me see if I can get it into the stream here. I don't think. Here we go. Add it to the stream. For some reason, it's not showing up on the screen. Okay, I don't know why. So let's see. If I can't solve the problem, I'm just going to read it. But I don't know why it's not.
I see it now.
Oh, do you see it now? Okay, great. So if you see it now, we're in good shape. Let me go back here. And also let me blow it up on the screen. Let me see if I can control it from here. I guess I can't. Okay, it's not like a regular window.
You can change the format of the screen layout. with StreamYard. You could show you could not show us at all.
Well, what I'm trying to do is get to the paper to just call your attention to just something, okay, in that paper. Okay, let me get it so that it's not that part that I want to get into. There's just a passage at the end in the conclusion by Andres of this paper that I think is really very interesting. Where's the conclusion? Okay. I'm sort of approaching this. Just give me another minute to get the quote that I want to read. Okay, so this is part of Andres's conclusion. We need global cooperation towards a global Green New Deal that focuses on decarbonizing and building out renewable energy capacity, a managed wind down of the fossil fuel industry with a just transition for workers, while building out a low carbon care economy and deep investments in frontline communities, especially communities of color that have borne the brunt of the fossil fuel industry for far too long. The U.S. can cancel external debts owed by developing global South countries, open up swap lines to ease payment issues, and open source transfer green technology to become a serious partner in this civilizational crisis. Financing the climate fight cannot rely on the private sector. The tab should all be on the public's balance sheet and paid for with public money. The reality of energy prices is that it's entirely political and dependent upon serious investments in a transition to a 100% renewable future. If you care about inflation and energy, you should be shouting for an MMT approach to a Green New Deal. The latest fight in Congress over infrastructure spending is a perfect example of the pitfalls of the pay for trap. Pay for is in quotes, of course, and the need to reject deficit and inflation hysteria if we're ever going to successfully take on climate change. Conservative Democrats and Republicans have wielded current inflationary pressures to water down necessary infrastructure investments, requiring the already pared down Build Back Better reconciliation bill to go through a CBO markup, only to face more necessary deficit hysteria and potential abandonment. This antiquated approach is dangerous and completely hypocritical, considering the long list of bills passed requiring no such deference to the balanced budget gods. So progressives wanted at least $10 trillion invested in green infrastructure, in line with what both conservative and liberal think tanks have said dealing with climate will cost the U.S. over the next decade. We will not get it by accepting right-wing pay-for framing. It is not fiscally responsible to put fictional accounting constraints over the heat death of the planet. By Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who has invoked MNT on several occasions and who's a personal friend of Andres Bernal, nailed the stakes of this moment on CNN's Don Lemon's show by explaining, quote, if we do not get the root cause of these price increases right, then policy decisions could be made that could negatively impact your life, unquote. Price increases, she explained, are confined to specific sectors dealing with reopening supply chain types of bottlenecks, Ocasio-Cortez warned against haphazardly raising interest rates, which would drive up unemployment and maybe even worsen inflation. As we seek to reconstruct the economy after a global pandemic, sorry, I lost that. The solution to the inflationary pressures we're seeing, she noted, is increasing spending on infrastructure and building out more resilient supply chains and productive capacity. This interview was truly a clinic on how elected officials should be talking about inflation. Now, this was not quite what I wanted to read, but given the daunting task of fundamentally transforming our economy and a way of life in the middle of climate shocks and social crises, will no doubt continue to face challenges to price stability. As we evaluate what must be done across time and space, as well as how this can or cannot be achieved, inflation and monetary theories premised on austerity, scarcity, and finitude will surely lead to even greater disasters than what far too many I regularly confront. The standard approach by many central banks to inflation has come at the expense of inclusive employment and any semblance of a fair economy. Will we forever tolerate disproportionate levels of unemployment borne by entire communities over generations while our leaders panic at the slightest decimal increase in prices? As Derek Hamilton notes, quote, those are politically charged questions, unquote. The almost instinctive impulse from experts, quote unquote, and laypersons alike to recoil at big deficits and long for balanced budgets preserves the fantasy of monetary purity and market fundamentalism. It is a testament to neoliberals' enduring grip over our imaginations. Instead, we must recenter the provisioning of society back onto a deliberative and normative focus that more accurately represents the economy as it already is: political, cultural, ecological, and interdependent. Therefore, understanding and managing inflation ultimately comes down to knowledge about the state of our society and industry specifics, our capacity to collectively create wealth and meet our needs, and how we define these objectives and the conditions required to achieve them. This entails presenting an alternative and superior theory that explains inflation, or rather price stability, instability, as a politics of coordination that involves various sectors, interests, organizational forms, and goals that have to manage and administer costs while responding to socially mediated needs and desires within particular constraints and contexts. More importantly, this interdependence is always and everywhere conditioned by a macro constitutional architecture that holistically shapes creative capabilities through the power of public law and money. This power today, most often outsourced to private bank lending, can bring about economic creation somewhere and take it away elsewhere. It can include and it can abandon. It can cultivate some aspects of humanity and deprive others. Currently, in the case of the United States, it is the Congress's authority over the public purse that can ultimately decide whether to fully employ or expand the nation's productive capacity, as well as define whether that capacity will be ecologically sustainable and just. With inflation hawks bearing down on Fed Chairman Powell to raise rates, and on the Biden administration to water down public spending, which of course is exactly what has happened, He wrote this towards the end of last year. It's crucial to fight back against the notion that current inflationary pressures are necessarily a result of too much printing of money from pandemic stimulus. By leveraging MMT's far more sophisticated inflation approach with political action, we can both determine and address the real root causes of high prices. We face a deepening housing crisis. Millions will soon have crushing loan debt reimposed unnecessarily, and we're nowhere near full employment. We need massive investments to end vaccine apartheid and to finance a 100% renewable energy economy as we force a managed wind down of the fossil fuel industry. We can guarantee the right to a living wage job, housing, healthcare, education, transportation, a dignified retirement, a shorter work week, global climate reparations, also reparations for slavery and indigenous genocide, publicly funded elections, student and medical debt cancellation, and so much more. As long as we can resource it, we can afford it with public money. MMT economist Stephanie Kelton said it best in the New York Times. The key to responsibly spending vast sums of money lies in carefully managing the economy's real productive limitations. In doing so, we open our social imaginations up to new political horizons. Now, I thought the significance, of what I read is that it focuses attention on not really the macro economy, but the microeconomy, and the micro society, social factors, cultural factors, not simply the macroeconomic factors. And it says that the MMT theory of inflation leads us there. It leads us into micro models. It leads us to going into sector after sector and determining the micro causes, of inflation, which will not be just an excess, of money, in particular areas, but failure to address other shortfalls in those areas, which can lead us to diffuse the inflationary tendencies in those areas. So I wanted to call attention to this because I think it's a great paper. And it says a lot about the real causes of inflation. It doesn't get us to a theory, but it outlines things that we should be paying attention to. Title of the paper is Inflationary Pressures in a Time of COVID-19, MMT is a theory, of inflation. And Andres Bernal wrote it towards the end of last year. He's a research fellow at the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. He's a lecturer at the City University of New York. And he's a doctoral student at the New School for Public Engagement. And of course, Stephanie is on his committee and is active in his dissertation. I don't know when it's going to be completed, but I think it's going to be on this. So I thought that was an interesting thing to call your attention to.
It's basically validating a lot of what we talked about, going out into the real world, solving those problems, because we know that those problems are what ultimately bubble up to the macroeconomy and will affect those macroeconomic measurements.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a very good way to put it.
I mean, everything is microeconomic in a sense. I mean, we can only deal with things in a microeconomic sense. The only way to deal with something in a macroeconomic sense is to create a national law that affects everybody all at once at the same time, depending on the law. But, if like we implement a job guarantee, that would be a macroeconomic application or policy, which would clearly improve the macroeconomy. But that's not the only way to improve the macroeconomy. And in fact, we can't just do that. That would be a huge step. But doing all of these things that Andres is outlining clearly have an effect on the macroeconomy. I mean, aside from no one should have an injustice on them. No one should be suffering. But we know that there are things that affect a lot more than others. And if you address those things, then that clearly will make the macroeconomic measurements of inflation and whatever else, GDP, improve. Well, GDP, forget GDP, but inflation improve.
Right. I completely agree with that, except for one more thing to keep in mind. That is, in complex adaptive systems, which societies happen to be, the micro levels, well, first I should start by saying the macro level is not just a summation of the micro levels. It has its own reality. It has its own influence from a causal point of view, on what goes on, at the micro levels. So what you have to do is you have to take account not only of what's going on, at the micro levels, but also at the relationship of the macro level to the micro levels. And of course the relationship of the micro level to the macro levels. So there are different social science fallacies that are relevant to what I just said. For example, there's something known as the ecological fallacy, where you take the position that because the macro level is behaving in a particular way, that its micro level components also have to behave, in that way. And then there's also the aggregative fallacy, which basically says that just because the micro levels, are a particular way, that doesn't mean that you can aggregate them and get a macro level that's going to operate in the same way the micro levels operate. They're two different levels. They affect each other. They're all part of the same system. And we have to track what goes on at the micro levels, what goes on at the macro levels, and the influences that the two have on each other continuously, the causal influences.
As Dirk said to me, you cannot separate microeconomics and macroeconomics. And macroeconomics is fundamentally a study of the systemic effects of microeconomics.
Yes.
And I interviewed someone named Andrew Chergwin, who is active on the Intro to MMT Facebook group, and he has a math degree, and he told me about something called the Sonnenschein Mentel de Bro, I think, theory. There's a paper, and with that paper basically says that once you get above, a certain small population, whatever that is, I don't know, above 100 people or something, that group is completely different than those 100 people, because the system, the collective, is fundamentally different than the people that make it up.
There are systemic constraints and systemic affordances, they're called.
Behaviors, I would say. There are systemic behaviors that are fundamentally different than individual behaviors, even though the system is made up of those individuals. And it's kind of, any of the fallacy of composition analogies that we're familiar with. One that Dirk shared, which is a little bit new, but pretty clear. If you're in a canoe and the canoe tips, then everybody in the canoe runs to individually deal with that, to run to the other side. But systemically, that's a horrible thing to do, because you need to have balance on the boat. And so the behavior of individuals is fundamentally different than the system, because even though that was the individually right thing to do, given the whole system, that was the very wrong thing to do.
When I spoke about the fallacy, okay, of aggregation, okay, the economists talk about that as the fallacy of composition.
Okay.
It's the same thing, it just has a different name. I was using the name that the sociologists give to it,
Okay.
as opposed to the name that the economists give to it, because my original training was more in political science and in sociology
Sure.
than it was in economics.
Right. Okay.
Okay, so I think we're good. I think we're good for the night. Okay, we ran a little over, but I think, thank you for a wonderful discussion.
I always enjoy talking with you. Thank you for having me on, and I look forward to next time.
Okay, it was my pleasure, and I look forward to the next one as well.
Cool.
So have a good night.
You too. See you, Joe. See you, everybody. See you, Bonnie.
Okay, bye, Jeff.
All right. Bye-bye.
Take care. Okay, so I still got a few minutes to take care of some comments. That's going to have to be necessarily brief. Let me see if it has to be necessarily brief. It won't have to be as brief as I originally planned. Hang on a second. Let me just answer a message that I just got here. I'll be with you in a minute. Okay, that does it. I'm back. Okay, I hope you like this. Sometimes I get the feeling when Jeff and I are talking that we have conversations that perhaps are not always so understandable as they might be. I try to do some defining of terms and things like that. Anyway, Lana says, I can speak for people who attend the MMT conferences. It's the most uplifting group to be with. I called Jeff when he said he was going to this conference and told him, I hate you. JK jealous. Okay. So, and Lana said, I see Dr. Darrity's point. Yes, so do I. I've always been, as a matter of fact, actually worried about that. Robert Copeland said, the one person that supports MMT that I would like to ask a few questions of is Steve Grumbine. Robert says, Steve Wolfbrand says, Robert, why? And Lana says, Steve introduced me to MMT in 2016. Kay says, Wall Street crashed again today. Okay, I got introduced to MMT at the end of 2009 by Warren Mosler. That was my introduction to it. So Robert says, why? Alana says, Steve introduced me to MMT 2016. I went through that. And Ghostat says, Jeff E. live streams with Ron Placone, okay, on MMT. I know he had Ron on his program a number of times. I weren't aware they were live streams. I thought they were parts of the podcast. Brandy says, not surprised. Kay says, yes, Ron is a great MMT supporter. And Steve says, I remember Grumbine marching to the convention in 2016. Seems like a different lifetime now. About his views on Medicare for all, and would he support giving money to the big corporate landlords, which I think would be a disaster. Okay, that's interesting comments. Okay, let me get to some other comments. Okay, says Kelton Day 1, hashtag mint the coin. And Jeffrey says the ghost of Fiddy, Fiddy, of course, is Lisa. And let me get to some other comments here. Scroll down faster. Robert, I've heard Grumbine and Savage Joy have some unpopular views on Medicare for All, but I haven't been following that. Robert says, like we had in the early 80s, Rocco was MMT Today. Yes, Rocco was on MM Tuesdays here. I got a new name for Savage Joy, Robert Copeland says. It's Toxic Joy. Kay says, yes, Robert, I can't stand to listen to her. Robert says, I think one of the biggest reasons for inflation is because of corporate greed. I think so too. I think that was certainly the case in this inflation. The price rises are astonishing and unforced. Ghostart says, my way or the highway is still what's traveled on going both ways. And Ghostart says, the climate has been radicalized. Robert Copeland said he's come a long way. It's weird. He's not snide or condescending. Who's that? You mean Steve is not snide or condescending? I'm not sure who the he was in that. Robert says, this is the first time I ever heard of Jeff Epstein, but so far I like what he was saying. Jeff is very good, and he's over the period of years, he's learned a huge amount, of MMT. So I certainly recommend him. He did it the hard way, through hard study. Lana says Jeff is on Facebook also here, and she also leaves his Twitter address. Thank you, Lana, for doing that. And Gustav says Amazon blamed inflation on a 17% price hike of Prime after profits soared 450% to a record $38 billion, avoiding $5 billion in taxes, spending $4 million on union busting, and denying workers paid leave. Thank you, Ghost Start. That was a wonderful comment. A wonderful comment. Jeff Denton says, yeah, monopoly, it can set the price of anything whenever it wants to. It's experiencing inflation. Lana says, just FYI, they do this conference every year. They do, the summer seminar. Josh, that says oil reserves, 40-year low inflation, 40-year high home affordability, 40-year low Joe Biden. I did that. Lana says, GDP doesn't measure a happiness factor. U.S. residents are pretty unhappy. Yeah, they are. It's a lot of things GDP doesn't measure. It wasn't intended to measure those things. It wasn't intended to be a general indicator. Its use in that way is actually a perversion of what Simon Kuznets, who designed the indicator, it's a perversion of what he had in mind, a misuse of what he had in mind. He's probably turning in his grave. Robert Colton says, here in California, we have like 5 or 6 highest GDP in the world. We have millions of people in poverty and an increasing homeless population. Robert, a lot of good comments tonight. My compliments. And Ghostart says, working at Estee Valley Tennis and a La Jolla Hotel car rental while managing a North Park apartment complex. Is that what you're doing, Steve? Jeff Denton says, Robert, Russia's GDP is less than half that of California, which just goes to show you how ridiculous the whole thing is. Ghostart says, the fat lady is ready to sing in the Ukraine. I think so. Robert says, how many military weapons are both sides losing in the war, and can both sides replace the losses in weaponry? I think the Russians have the manufacturing capacity to replace their losses. A big question which has arisen lately is, do we have the manufacturing capacity to replace our losses? We've been supplying Ukraine with HIMARS recently to the extent, I think, we're proposing to give them a total of 18 HIMARS. That's supposed to be 1/3 of our own stock. The question is, do we have the manufacturing capacity to replace that in a time that would be relevant for supporting Ukraine any further? And the estimates that I've heard people I trust actually give is that no, we don't have that manufacturing capacity because we've offshored too much of our manufacturing capacity. So, Gostart says at Robert Copeland, most of the weapon contraband is ending up in Poland or destroyed, captured by Russia. I've heard that too, Gostart, from sources I trust. Gostart says we spend, how many zeros is that? Is that $1.8 trillion every year subsidizing industries? Let's see, that's which are rendering our planet uninhabitable. Yes, Gostart. I believe that statistic, though I haven't seen it for myself. It's very believable to me. Gostart says German farmers have joined with the Dutch protesters. Yeah, it won't be long before populations of Europe say, no, we don't want this anymore. You have to stop this. And once the Europeans say it has to be stopped, we can't go anymore, that's it for NATO. And we don't have the capacity to keep them warm this winter. They are, in the end, going to have to turn to the Russians. There's no other way out. And another agnostic says nothing is possible as long as the oligarchs have control. What we're talking about is the possibility of their losing control. Of course, that says AOC, there's the micro and the macro. The macro has a micro, macro, and the macro. Micro has a macro, macro, a macro, micro. Kay says, well, I'm tired and going to bed. Love you all. We love you too, Kay. And and Jeff, who tuned in to make a comment, says, oh, I hate you too, Lana. Somehow I doubt that. Anyway, once again, Jeff, thank you for that fine discussion. It was really good. And thank you for the many fine comments here tonight, everybody. We really enjoyed those. And I think it's time to say goodnight. It's 10:58. And I think we are going to say goodnight. So good night. I'm ending the broadcast.